All right, what did you miss the most?
I miss going to school, playing on playgrounds, playing with my friends.
The most thing I miss about my school is the food vendor because I like the rice, the beans, the egg, and because I normally buy the egg, the donut, and the chin-chin.
In quarantine, I miss school and my classmates, their laughter, and my friends. And I miss the gossip in the school corridor and disturbing lessons, with giggling, for example.
What I miss most in school is my math class because I don't really understand the online teaching.
They do not explain well, and some of us we don't understand the way they write on the whiteboard. Their handwritings are rough.
This is DW's COVID-19 special. I'm Kate Ferguson. Thanks for joining me. The coronavirus has upended the lives of hundreds of millions of children around the world. In many countries, kids have been cooped up at home for weeks, forcing parents to become educators while working their regular jobs. Now, as restrictions begin to be lifted, for some kids here in Europe, it's back to school. But what can they expect when they return? This next report takes us to Norway and Denmark.
In Norway, just going to school looks like you're on vacation. That's the way it was before the coronavirus crisis hit, and the way it still is now. Osman has been bringing his two boys, Embrik and Lawrence, to the bus stop every morning for the past 4 weeks. The strictest hygiene rules apply inside the school bus, but things will look different at school today. For the time being, they're keeping separate areas for each class. We have a larger area over there, and the other class can meet behind the playground. Good hygiene practices have always been compulsory in Norwegian schools. What's new is that the minimum distance of 1 meter is no longer needed, even though there's plenty of space between the tables in Embrik's classroom. But for the teacher Lena Haugenset, one thing is much more important.
The teachers can finally hold the children in their arms again and comfort them when they've fallen down, for example. It hasn't been possible for a while. It's very unnatural if you have to put on a mask every time.
So far, Norway has had only positive experiences with its school openings. Norwegian epidemiologists have discovered that children hardly infect each other. They feel that the school opening confirms their findings.
Our advice was not to close the schools at that time. It was a political decision in a very confusing situation.
Now the Norwegian government is unsure that the school closings were even necessary. A few hundred kilometers to the south is Copenhagen, Denmark. Like the Norwegians, the Danes also follow very strict coronavirus guidelines. They were the first Scandinavian country to close the borders, shops, and schools. But kindergartens and primary schools reopened in mid-April. And in a funny way, too. The Tivoli amusement park in the middle of Copenhagen let daycare groups into the empty park free of charge. Teachers go outside with their students as often as possible. The infection rate remains low despite open schools. One of the great critics of the school openings, Allan Randrup, a virologist at the University of Copenhagen, has changed his mind over time. There were many who, like me, were worried about the schools reopening. But all the data so far has shown us that these concerns were unfounded. The experience we've had in Denmark is the best argument for the schools reopening. Back in Norway, kids are gearing up for the summer break. In places, it will look like this scene with Embrik and his classmates. The view that learning, playing, or even swimming children hardly play a role in the transmission of the coronavirus has become more and more accepted, at least in Scandinavia.
For more on the reopening of schools, I'm joined now by Pazzi Salberg, Professor of Education Policy at the Gonski Institute at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Professor Salberg, welcome to the programme. You've described this time as the biggest educational experiment in history. What did you mean by that?
Well, never before in the history we have had almost all the schools in the world closed for several weeks. We had about 1.5 billion children learning from home when their classes and schools were closed. So this is one part of the experiment. Then the other one is that our school systems around the world have never experienced such a kind of a rapid shift in the core way of working, that is a classroom-based teaching, into online learning. And these two areas, two parts of the experiment makes it an interesting thing.
You've written that kids returning to school may need more breaks, more time to play than they had before. Why do you say that?
Well, one thing is that the time for children to play, have time for themselves during the school days around the world has really reduced during the last 20 years. And now is the time when the children are returning to school to reconnect, the re-socialize back to their friends, after the several weeks of being home with the parents. The other thing is a medical reason. All the pediatricians and medical experts are saying that this type of lockdown and social distancing that the children have had when they have been staying away from schools and with their families can be emotionally very demanding for children. And there's nothing better to do to help kids when they're in school than give them more time to be with their friends and talk about how they feel and what's going on with their lives.
There's also been a lot of talk about the digital divide children have experienced during lockdown. Tell me about what that means.
Well, the interesting thing is that already before the COVID crisis and all these lockdowns and school closures, we knew that although most families and most people were connected to the internet, but we knew that there were some issues and some places where that was not possible. Now we do know this much better. What this pandemic has really revealed around the world is that we cannot really rely on the fact that the internet connection and access to the internet would mean that the children, for example, would have a reliable connection to all the services and things that they would need from their schools. In many places, the vast majority of children have not had a proper connection to those platforms and teaching that the schools have provided. The other thing is that there are a number of schools, actually only 2/3 of the schools in the OECD countries report that they have facilities and know-how within the school to properly provide online teaching to the children at home. So these things together really create this divide that I think we understand much better now after the pandemic and school closures than before.
Professor Salberg, thank you so much for your time. Time now to answer your questions about COVID-19. Over to our science correspondent, Derek Williams.
If you live in a country where there are no active cases of COVID-19 and the borders are closed, is it still necessary to wear a mask after 14 days?
The debate on whether or not to wear a mask and when has been going on for months, and I'm certainly not going to solve it definitively here when the WHO took so long to make up its mind that it's a good idea. But no one denies that if they aren't worn properly and washed or disposed of regularly, masks can potentially do more harm than good. So healthcare authorities all over the world will be taking that into account as they tighten or loosen restrictions on wearing them. In the situation you describe, no active cases in the country for 14 days and closed borders, I personally would hope and expect that I could leave my mask at home, but then maybe I'm biased. I mean, I really hate wearing them.
If you contract COVID-19 but don't succumb to it, can the virus still cause damage that can build up and harm you down the line?
We'll only find this out in the coming months and years as any possible creeping physical effects make themselves known. But the expectation is that most of those who have no symptoms or relatively mild symptoms of the disease will recover as fully as they would from any other respiratory sickness. However, there's no question that people who have severe cases of COVID-19, like those who have to be intubated and ventilated, that they can end up with serious damage to their lungs that will remain with them for the rest of their lives. The same goes for patients whose kidneys are affected, or those who have embolisms or strokes caused by blood clotting.
If they're not sure about immunity due to antibodies in patients who have recovered, then what's the difference with vaccine-induced antibodies?
How the body responds to an infection with a pathogen is complex, and it involves more than just producing antibodies. For example, what are known as T cells also play a big role in immune response and in future immunity. We still don't know exactly how it all works with COVID-19, but what we do know from other diseases is that immunity can be influenced by how badly you had the disease. If that holds true for COVID-19 as well, then people who had mild cases might later not be as immune to reinfection as someone who had a bad case. So one thing vaccine developers are trying to do is mimic the strong immune system response caused by a bad infection, but obviously without the symptoms that led to it. The goal is to induce immunity with a vaccine that would be even better and last even longer than if you had a severe case of the disease.